Oh, there it is. It's live.
Ooh, I heard it. You could like hear it change.
Oh, really?
Do you ever, maybe at the beach you would have it. Like at my beach, there are big walls, big barriers. And when you stand up on them, you're really close to the streetlights, and you can like hear really, really clearly the electricity from them.
Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking about. It is Lynch.
Yeah, Lynch like talks about how if you blindfolded somebody, you could still like feel the electricity by walking by something.
Yeah. Possible.
Like one of my friends, his dad's an electrician, and when they would go to when they'd go to people's houses, sometimes if they were really close to wires, they could just take out like like I don't know, I think they're called electrometers, but it tells when there's electric current. They could just stick it up in the air, even if it's like pretty far away from a transformer or something, and there was electricity in the air.
All right, are you ready to? I'm gonna preface it. So nihilism, group chat number 4. We're talking about nihilism. Nihilism in general. Does it exist? What does it mean? What are the categories? Nihilism, worship of the void, or something else? What's the difference between the void and nihilism?
Please forgive me if I leave you feeling
That feels too intelligent and a Rick and Morty watcher to understand nihilism.
my only pleasure is to make that bubble burn. I can't find comfort in so many things for which I should be glad.
Censored. Censored by it. Glitched it. Can you hear me, other Elliot?
Yeah.
Does your mic work?
Does it?
Yes.
It does. It does work. You can hear the music. So what do you have to say about nihilism? I like the topic of nihilism.
I don't know if I have anything to say about it.
There's the spirit. Yeah, there's the spirit of nihilism right there.
I've been reading a lot of secondary sources on Nietzsche, and all of them begin with like, let's define nihilism. And like at a certain point, you're just like, just stop, just don't do that. That's stupid.
All right.
Nobody cares.
That's a good point. Nobody really does.
It's like, oh, let's break it down etymologically. Let's not do that. Fuck it.
Like every analysis of Nietzsche is so superficial. Like I say a lot that like every motivational speaker is just the most superficial Nietzsche.
I'm gonna give you will to your power. Let's make it happen.
I feel like he only got the label of nihilism because he just said he went against Christianity in the first place. So then he goes, oh, if you don't believe in God, then you're a nihilist, right? So Nietzsche, calling Nietzsche a nihilist, I feel like is totally off. Doesn't make any sense at all, really.
But he
just
does
sort of believed in the godless universe.
He does talk about nihilism, though.
All right. How so?
Well, he thinks it's a process of erosion of values, or of disappearance of values. Steam is trying to start up. So, I mean, I think that's one reason he's associated with it. You mentioned another, is that people call him a nihilist because of his you know, he wrote a book where he's like, I'm the Antichrist and stuff. But yeah, he also talked about it. So he's like a philosopher of nihilism. So that's the other reason he's associated with it.
You probably watched a lot of Rick and Morty. How much Rick and Morty did Nisha watch? Did Nisha watch them all? Did you only watch half the season? Did you watch
Elliot, you're really like badly coming through right now.
You can't hear me?
Okay, that's better. You're like you're breaking up.
It's annoying. Is that not annoying? Then we have a problem.
It probably wasn't your mic. That looks like such a beautiful mic. I don't think that can be the problem.
It's probably on the wrong mic. Here we go. Now it's much better. Correct?
Ooh.
All right.
So it's like warm, soft. There's bass.
This is the Blue Snowball microphone. Made for professional podcasting to you and your home. My name is Elliot Rosenstock, psychotherapist, marriage and family therapist. You're listening to Sigmund Freud's Dank Meme Stash Nihilism Chat. And once again, the topic is nihilism, and we're talking about how much Rick and Morty you should watch.
It's beautiful. You move me to tears. That.
Let's see. So, I just think nihilism is such. I think it's a false ideal. It's like Lacan's image ideal. It's a like object nihilism is its own sort of object petit because it's an ideal that is totally unreachable. You cannot be a nihilist. Nihilism is something you can point at, like the object cause of desire is something you can point at, and it's kind of unreal. And you know it's a relevant Rick and Morty episode. You know that there's an episode in Rick and Morty where there's a parasite that burrows into the brain of all the family members, and they can create memories all the way back in their entire lifespan.
Yeah.
So Rick wrote down the number. He was like, okay, there's 6 of us, but of course one of them. Then they keep multiplying, right? So then they eventually found out, spoiler alert, if you don't have any bad memories, it's a fake memory.
Right.
And I thought that was very Lacanian. Because that's the essence of the object cause of desire, is it's unreal.
Right.
And it's ideal. So in the same way nihilism is this unreal ideal. Because we would like to sort of point at, we would like to rid ourselves of all spooks, de-spook ourselves. Stirner wasn't, the first to think, oh man, I would like to get rid of all these ideals that are imposed on me and all that. Right.
Right. Well,
So,
that is good. Nice Lacanian breakdown of Rick and Morty. I mean, really, we could that could be a whole series. And I'm not averse to that. I'll have to get my own microphone though for that.
But you forget, psychoanalysis is non-scientific, and thus, how we are not intelligent enough to analyze the brilliant scientific Rick and Morty. You have to be a physicist.
Shit, you're right.
Like we can't even try. We are left. It's scientific brilliance.
you know what's weird is I work in high schools and I hear people talk about Rick and Morty in the hallways, and I'm like, okay, I can sort of see what people are talking about when people say they're annoyed when people talk about it. But okay,
Yeah.
So back to nihilism.
High schoolers are pretty much annoying almost no matter what they do.
That's,
and-
that's
But
one
yeah,
way
oh man, I want to go back to high school. It's such a trip. Every time I've gone back to like high school and it's been 3 or 5 or 6 years, like I'm there for some random reason. It's like a trip.
Is every high schooler a nihilist?
I mean, ideally, I mean, there's the. I want to reframe this because basically, I think you successfully debunked the idea of nihilism as a professed ideology or ideal to embrace. It's bullshit. But originally, most of the thinkers that discussed nihilism, or thinkers that we've retroactively went back and said, well, they were talking about nihilism. They weren't talking about something to aspire to. They were simply talking about what was happening in Europe at the turn of the century, in the middle of the 19th century, and just in terms of the breakdown of sureties that at least publicly people would say, well, yeah, that's true. Or, yeah, that's the right thing to do. We don't need to debate that. But no debate has to happen on these issues. And so the idea that those sureties have broken down, for better or worse, like Nietzsche wasn't saying, yeah, destroy the church because I hate it because it's slave morality. He was like, it's just happening. It's going to come apart. He wasn't necessarily egging it on. He was saying this is just happening, whether because of science or various other things, technology that were going on. And so, and there's the thesis that it's the breakdown of those traditional authority structures that allowed things like Nazi Germany or other authoritarian movements to come in because people wanted something to hold on to. And the other institutions, they just couldn't, the church couldn't come in and be like, all right, we know how to double crop yields and everyone's going to get fed because that was not where they invested their brain power,
So on one end of nihilism, by the way, I accidentally posted the stupid link on my personal page instead of the group. I just realized that and fixed it.
Oh.
That was dumb. That's awesome. Second of all, so there's nihilism sort of implies that there's a second one, which is like you were saying, oh, the church promised this, that there's gonna be paradise and everything's gonna be great. So the ultra meaning, right? Super duper double surplus meaning value. So on one end you have God is dead. Ergo, value is dead. The beginning of this sort of popular, it wasn't the first use of nihilism to describe Nietzsche, but it's sort of that label got tagged on him. And then a sort of so I guess the initial stage of nihilism has to be value, has to be overvalue, right? And then if we look at it Lacanianly, we all overvalue because we all have the object Lacan says he's an atheist, which means he's I just talked with my therapist. He said Lacan was an atheist.
Can you spell that?
Atheist. But it was like a pun. So he believed in there's the object ideal, the
right.
object which is sort of becomes is sort of the religious ideal.
Right.
And it, depending on the person, it gets transferred in various different modes of thought. You know what I realized? I need an objectivity.
Let's think about nihilism as a sense, as something sensual, rather than as idea.
I agree.
Every high schooler is a nihilist, and it's because it's ennui. It's a weariness. You're tired of everything, and like you said, it comes from overvaluing. So I would say like a high school senior that has gone through all this, maybe they've tried to do well earlier on. They're like, wow, none of this means anything. I'm leaving this year. Why bother? Or a religious person that has dealt with religion their whole life only for it to fail them in a time of need, and it's this overwhelming tiredness, sort of an acceptance of nothing. But I would say it's essentially impossible for it to go on. Nihilism is not like a permanent state, just as any feeling or emotion is not permanent.
All right, so you're saying it's a sense of resignation, the melancholy. I would ask you, Chris, why couldn't that go on forever? Sounds like something that could.
Death.
Yeah. Well. Okay.
Well, I would
yeah.
say if it goes on too long, then it would lead to suicide without a doubt.
Well, you know what? Freud actually had a good point about this. Freud said the mind does not actually know death. We can't know death. In that the unconscious, we don't have an experience of death. So we can sort of, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he talks about death is sort of, it's an abstract concept, but it's a concept that we do not fully internalize and cannot fully understand. So he says the unconscious, in a way, is immortal because of that lack of real conception of death and the lack of experience.
The tarot card of death doesn't mean literal death; it means change. We have an archetype of death, but it doesn't actually mean the physical death.
Right, but there may also be a sense in which the unconscious lives without time.
Jung talks about the archetype, the unconscious as being completely timeless and spaceless. Like you could have a dream. You could have, Swedenborg.
Yeah.
Who had a vision of a fire in his hometown, Stockholm, and it was actually going on at the same time, but he had, there was no way of him actually knowing it. But he experienced it. And he knew when the fire would stop, which house it would stop at, and it turned out to be true. It was well documented by several people at the party. So essentially, like a timeless and spaceless, immortal, unconscious. Even if it's not real, we can make it real.
Right. Well, I mean, even in the more mundane sense that we're projecting, say, some earlier traumatic experience onto a current interaction where we're like, we're projecting or experiencing transference with someone or with the therapist. And it's as if we're back where we were before, where we felt whatever we felt in that situation. So in that way, it's also timeless, or at least not dealing with time in a regular way.
I feel that is the essence of our fictional concept of time travel. Is sort of being able to feel something that you'd felt before, seeing something that triggers. If Cal Pesh is here, I want his take.
I don't think Cal Pesh is here.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine how great that would be?
Let's talk about time travel.
Okay.
What are you saying about time travel and nihilism? I want to hear that.
Time travel is being able to feel something that you'd felt before. It's essentially having a means of triggering an older feeling. Like something much deeper than emotions.
Like a full sensory experience.
Yes.
Like that we sometimes have in dreams, even though people say dreams are largely visual. Sometimes dreams are, or the recollection of a dream is incredibly vivid. There's touch, there's smell, there's everything. But that seems much rarer. I don't know what people's personal experience is, but mine certainly jives with that.
Yeah. I feel like, so one of the things that we started talking about was, let's define, that first thing Elliot said was defining nihilism is kind of stupid. Kind of ruins the fun of it like a lot. So there's something Dionysian about nihilism.
Without a doubt. But it also I would say that an eternal nihilism is a cycle that leads to an Apollonian. Perhaps the initial, or perhaps anybody thinking about nihilism interprets it in a Dionysian manner, but nihilism is so Apollonian that okay. Nihilism is Dionysian thought for an Apollonian, which is why it causes suicide. It's like the universe means nothing, and it's all it's all meaningless, it's all evil. Versus a Dionysian is like, man, it means nothing. It's it's all evil, whatever. Let's get drunk. Versus the Apollonian who kills themselves over the meaninglessness.
So nihilism is something that can be both Apollonian and Dionysian. So it can be both.
But if we define nihilism as it's usually defined, it is strictly Apollonian, I would say.
Yeah, but we shouldn't do that.
Okay, let's just define nihilism
Now we have to do
buying
it. Yeah.
time travel.
In relation to what? Sorry.
Buying a ticket to time travel.
Okay.
Guys, I don't have anything. I don't have anything related to that.
No.
So, but like you were saying, okay. So another thing nihilism could be the relieving of responsibility of any sort of, to sort of refute the nihilism in the Apollonian sense. Apollonian sense is a suicidal gesture. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's a release. It represents a release of sort of the cognitive hold, and I think that sort of thing can benefit people that aren't necessarily Dionysians.
But don't you think that a total lack of belief, in essence, is a denial of your own everything?
But that's the thing. That's the thing I was talking about. Is it's not a total lack of belief. It's an ideal that you point at.
You can't ever achieve that. For an Apollonian, the idea of a total lack of belief might be terrible. It might sound terrible to them, whereas to someone else it might sound good, but it doesn't matter because either way, that's not something you can be. You can actually be. You can start to shed. You can go in the direction of having less convictions, less sure values, but it's like a singularity you move towards. There's no reality of it. And when all these thinkers, Nietzsche among them, talk about the problem of nihilism, it's usually they get to a social level where they're like, it's not that everyone becomes completely valueless, it's just that enough people are enough uncertain about what they're supposed to do that then the norms of society break down on a material level, and there's chaos.
Nihilism is essentially only an insult that people in power would give to people who are attempting to shuffle off society-given responsibilities, and that there can be nihilism without the context of because if we continue, if nihilism leaves the societal realm, then doesn't it become the individual denial?
Well, it starts with the individual. It has to, in my psychological understanding of nihilism. Go ahead, Elliot.
I think we should instead of talking about nihilism, we should embrace nihilism and forget the topic of nihilism and just talk. If we could talk about anything we wanted, we can actively embrace the object ideal of nihilism and just talk and relieve ourselves.
I don't want to.
No, we can. Well, there you go. You can talk about whatever you want.
I'm gonna go get my power cord.
Oh no! Oh no! There he goes. Nihilism already affecting the group chat. All right.
A power cord.
Yeah.
Cord is on the cord, like a cord. I'll look it up just to be sure. I don't want to sound like an idiot. But I believe that a cord is the center.
Interesting. Nihilism as the center of power. Because there's a void at the center. So if nihilism as a power cord.
Well, we have moral bonds.
Wait, never mind. I thought it glitched out. So I always thought the thing I really wanted to talk about was how nihilism is different than the void, and I think the idea of the void is very real, whereas nihilism is very unreal. Nihilism is sort of an ideal, whereas the void is a natural occurring lack between speech and anything and the thing in of itself, the phenomena and the nomina, the undescribable nomina so there is a void sort of at the center of our understanding, right? So in a way though, that's sort of
What do you think about the call of the void?
I think the lack of understanding is also a source of a power and an unconscious reserve, right? So The void is we're talking about the void as a power chord. So this
as a power chord, like
no, not as like a power chord, like
no.
But it's like a way that the unconscious could influence anything at any time. Like because when you have the call of the void, it's like driving a car and you're like, I'm gonna fucking turn it off the side of the road and kill my family. Or when you're eating and you're like, instead of cutting this meat, I could cut my thumb off.
I'm gonna make that a direct quote. I'm gonna drive this car off the side of the road and kill my family. Chris Smith.
That is the unconscious power chord, utilizing a lack. Because oftentimes you get it in a situation where you're kind of like out of it. So it's when the unconscious can come in and be like, let's fuck it up.
The unconscious, I feel like, is inescapable, though. I think the lack of embrace, the sort of picking at the ideal Oz. So nihilism itself past the symbol of the object A as the ideal that's pointed at. I feel like in general nihilism and the void can be used as a tool that gives strength, because God is God. Hegel says God can only be found through negation, and Lacan repeats that. So the negating of the value sets in a way is finding God through the death of God, or the power, finding the power. And Nietzsche talks about the Übermensch, finding the power of the individual through the negation of God. You know what I mean, man?
I think
you know what I'm saying, man.
That kind of it's like consider that what happens after you are rid of God is not always something beautiful. You've heard of naming the witch?
No.
Well, you can remove power from anybody that has magic because you can know their name, and when you give them a name, they lose their power. And it kind of reminds me, if you've read in Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, like the first part deals with Brother Klaus, who I think was a Swedish monk, and he saw the face of God and drew it vividly on his wall. But people could not bear to look at him after that because his face had become horrible. It was
his own face.
His own face. You could not look at his face. And so when you come face to face with that, with an emptiness or God, you too will become horrible and distorted. You will no longer be you'll no longer exist in the context of what you saw, because it's ceased to have power.
What is this story from?
Brother Klaus. It's like a real thing.
Well, it's a story in the sense that there's narrative content, but where is it? I missed the preamble. So who is it about?
Brother Klaus.
We're talking about power and the void, the power of the void.
He's a Swiss hermit.
Okay.
Also known as Nicholas of Flue.
Nice. Have you guys heard of the imp of the perverse?
The what of the perverse now?
The imp of the perverse?
No, but we were talking, me and Chris were talking, I remember a while ago, maybe I think there's pre-R even chats about the dwarf. Oh no, maybe this was in the comment section. The dwarfs and the image of the dwarf as a perverse internally as a dream figure.
Yeah.
So the imp of the perverse. Let's talk about that. What's that about?
Oh, this is just going back to what we were talking about 5 minutes ago. It's the imp of the perverse is a metaphor for the urge to do exactly the wrong thing in a given situation, for the sole reason that it's possible to do it. There's no motivation. It's not like Chris is gonna drive off the road and kill his family because he hates them or he's sad. He just might do it just because. There's just it flashes into his head. I could drive right into the Meridian and we would all be smashed.
That's like when kids.
I feel like
when kids flip off.
I feel like there's always the possibility. If you're driving, I always think it's like, man, I forget. I thought this, and then I think I heard it on a TV show. It's like, man, one turn of the wheel and you're on the news. Really though, there is that sort of just the fact that there is that aspect of radical freedom, right? To
Elliot,
do the worst possible thing.
Well,
one
and
turn of the wheel and you're on the news. The wheel of fortune.
Fortune.
It's true. Like in the most basic sense, like any movement of fate, and you can, you know, begin and change.
But I think it's not entirely uncommon. I think the classic example is you're at the top of a cliff, like a way too high cliff. It's not like a watering hole. You could never survive this fall, but you want to look. Then you look, and you feel a kind of tiny urge to be like, just jump, or like, what would happen if you fell? And this kind of thing occurs to people, regardless of their mental state, their mood, and largely people don't act on this. And if they do, we probably don't know about it because they're dead, right? But
well, like I said, it's an ideal. Nihilism is the ideal. The imp of the perverse is the ideal. There's something in the idea of what is the worst possible thing, right? There's what is the best possible thing, and that's almost impossible to find out because you think of what is the best possible thing, and then you try to emulate the best possible thing.
Well, the best possible thing, according to the Greeks, is to never be born.
The best possible thing. I've
It's
heard
never
that.
See here we have a convergence of the worst and the best. Because man, I'm hearing myself.
Well, they're both in object A. They're both.
It's really bumming me out. Is there anybody who can put headphones on, or is that just an impossible wish?
What's happening? Are you getting reverb?
No, I'm just hearing myself.
just a bit.
All right. I'll try and get over it. No, but there's an overlap here where you're bored, which is the worst, or it's not the worst, it's just not the best. And then you imagine doing the worst, like jumping off a cliff. And that's kind of entertaining. Maybe your adrenaline spikes. And so there's a little bit being like, I could break out of mundanity at any point by doing something totally unexpected, precisely because it's so dangerous. And
or
so
terrible.
Or terrible. And if your ideal is to never be bored, then maybe it's worth doing something terrible.
Never be born.
Oh, never be born. Okay.
But I like never be bored even more.
I like that too. I think that's a good miss here.
That should be like our that should be our will. Never be bored.
But never be bored can mean always be terrified. So it's not.
It reminds me of Crowley. It reminds me of Aleister Crowley because that was kind of like his will. He did like a lot of ugly things just because they were ugly, simply for the purpose of like, I'm not going to sit around and do nothing. I'm not going to follow all the norms. So, like you said, the imp of the perverse and the greatest thing is to never be bored. So, he would do all of these things that most people scoff at, and he was called the most evil man in the world, but he just did it to not be bored, to do his own will.
Right.
I wonder if that's Nick Land's motivation for his neo-reactionary stuff. It's like, what's the worst ideal set? And then he talks about. And then he talks about because he wasn't always a neo-reactionary, and then he turns.
Right.
So I wonder if that's sort of a reaction of the thirst for annihilation manifest in the worst. He pointed at the worst thing he can think of, and he talks about in Dark Enlightenment.
Right.
Hitler is the new Satan now that God is dead.
Right.
So he points at this sort of like ethno-state ideal. And then he riffs off that, maybe out of a way to not be bored or something.
Peterson is sort of like he tries to be like Percival. He like tries to be as pure and as he really tries to.
I think that's so funny. I see that too.
It's like he's sort of the opposite of Nick Land in that case. Like he wants to be bored all the time. Like he wants he wants goodness. He wants morality. Which I think is funny because Jung talks a lot about how really confronting the shadow is essentially denying your own morality. and saying like, yes, I am immoral. I am also moral. It's not just like straighten yourself out. Like I like Peterson a lot. I think he's a necessary counterbalance to sort of the vague nihilism that is everywhere, which is why everybody hates him. And like, if you like, he gets posted in our group, and it's just like massive comment threads, just like this evil, his horrible. What?
Everyone hates B-person.
I don't know what. Like I know, but I like him a lot.
It's obvious why, because he goes on these sort of right traditional conservative rants sometimes. But if there's anyone who's
I think that's why.
Is he not like the ultimate Apollonian though? Like really, like the traditional. He says, life. He even says marriage isn't about being happy.
Right.
It's just true.
It's about not feeling terrified.
People don't. That's a big thing. Let's talk about that. That's a really big thing. If you ever go on Our Relationships, which is where people go to complain about the relationships that they're in,
I've never been actually.
It is the most trivial nonsense you will ever hear. Like it's very depressing to me because I know that we're going to have a generation of people who don't get married and never enter into serious relationships because their standards are literally impossible. Like they actually expect fantasy. They have a total, and like I think that was kind of a thing with the older days. It was maybe more of an acceptance. Like, yeah, we're not perfect. Oh, my husband cheats. Oh, my wife has whatever. Whatever. There was kind of a more passive acceptance of like, okay, we make mistakes, we do bad things.
Now anything we all have. I feel like the power of that ideal that object has gotten this weird institutional right. Now you have a right for the impossible ideal to be fulfilled, which could be a really bad part of relationships because it's not necessarily like the relationship needs to be great, but there's always, it's what sort of power do you give to the ideal that is totally inaccurate, this totally schizoid position.
Because we're raised with such hyper-capitalism, we're so used to being given the object of our desire, what we believe it to be, so that when we're in a relationship and we find that the other person is not what we imagine them to be,
they never are, because that's impossible.
We take it as absolute denial. We take it as evil. We take it as like, this person is so wrong for me. When am I going to find the right guy? When am I going to find the right guy? So like you have incels who are kind of like, they rather than saying like, oh, one girl wasn't who I thought she was. It's sort of all women are not. They are the opposite of the ideal. All women are pure evil. Or rather than the obvious thing, which is like, oh wow, I'm in love with an idea, not with a real human being.
We all have object A. We all have the object A's in us. So we all have these ideals. We all have our Rick and Morty ideal in terms of like the evil, the fake parasite monster that puts in memories, but the memories are only good. So we all have those object A. But then I think it's what degree everybody's tortured by them. And the difference is what degree are you tortured by the object A? Because I don't think you can escape that. It's to what degree do you know how to negate it through other actions, right?
Well, that was the beauty of the moral, which was a psychological moral of that episode, was that they were able to discern who was real because they had terrible memories about them, where they had done shitty things to them, and it's not that there's anything good about somebody doing shitty things. It's that means they're real. They're not a fantasy construction. Either your own fantasy construction or that of an alien parasite inside of your head.
Yeah.
So, Nick Land is such a good and unique thinker is because he's so obsessed with sort of a horrifying look at everything. So a lot of people might claim, a lot of people are like, oh, when you deny so much, you essentially deny reality. But I think through Landian criticism, you are able to give serious depth and reality to things.
That's true. So the left would actually be very benefited by reading. I think that there's some intangible draw I have to that really dark stuff, And even though it's totally wrong, you know what's funny about all the neo-reactionary sort of ethno-state ideals is it's just so wrong that they really like if we take out the fact that it's racist, let's just take out like I'm fully as a sort of I love things that piss people off, so let's just take out the aspect that it's racist. You really think you'll be more happy in a singular ethno state? It's just not fucking true. I really don't. I just
they want happiness. I think they want power.
Is a real ideal.
Isn't it more about power and sort of a sexual dominance?
It's not. Yeah, it's about something. There's something about it.
There's unity. It's sort of like a Andy Warhol beauty. It's the Warholian modernist beauty of absolute unity and uniformity.
Yeah, but as a galvanizing vision, that impossible ideal, however you view it, whether it's in a racial ethno state or a utopian, multicultural, socialist, hive mind or whatever, that vision is very powerful and can galvanize people to a certain extent to do stuff for you and to just do stuff in the world. So I would imagine, maybe he's just dumb, but I would imagine Nick Land knows that that's not true, but he also knows that talking about that as a possibility motivates people to do stuff. And so if you're
pure, it's like a very pure magical way of doing things. Like, oh, I'm going to manipulate people so that I can shape the world to be more interesting rather than good or bad. Right. And to bring whatever resources towards him for his weird personal vision about technology and the singularity, which I do not understand at all. But
read Neuromancer.
Read Neuromancer?
It's basically he like makes a philosophy out of Neuromancer, really.
Okay. Well, maybe my problem is I never finished Neuromancer, so I need to go back.
Oh yeah, because the end of Neuromancer, can I spoil the whole book for everybody?
No, please don't.
Okay. Okay. I won't then. I won't spoil the book. But it really does shift like in a totally unpredictable way. And there's my idea about what is Neuromancer. Stuff like that.
All right. Well, man, that's a tasty tease right there. I gotta.
Yeah. So I think we can look at nihilism in a way as this fight. We were talking about uniformity and these sort of various ideal object A uniformities. So there's the socialist, communist vision of uniformity within a multi sort of faceted but singular ideal set, and then there's the right-wing ethno state. So nihilism can sort of be used as the ultimate fighter, is the other object A against, because it's not it's such an obviously incomplete ideal set. It doesn't really have that rallying power behind it.
Right.
So it calls in a way that it can construct other things, but it doesn't really have a flag. You can't really have a nihilism flag. And they have flags for everything. They don't have a nihilism flag, really.
They're flagless. It's a pole that you hit people with.
We're getting very close to that. The flags are getting smaller, and it's more and more just a pole that people are hitting each other with. So that's a very real thing. That's a really good metaphor. Too apt, Chris. Too apt.
People that think that their ideology has any relation to reality, it's very sad. That's why it's really strange that you have so many people that have kind of like abandoned free speech or like rights.
Yeah.
Even though they're essentially non-existent, but in your day-to-day life, they will have influence. The concepts will have influence. Why would you intentionally remove something that will make things, more comfortable for you? I mean, it's like a very, very masochistic goal for something that literally cannot. It's all these actions undertaken for a completely impossible goal. It's like
it's masochistic, but it's sadistic as well because you're inflicting that on other people.
Mm-hmm.
You're inflicting.
You think it's all about? You think when they vote to like take away rights, that it's that it's intention. It's for them to feel good about taking others or to feel bad about their own being taken. Like, because everybody can be sadistic. It's easy to be sadistic. But politically it's hard to be. It's more difficult to be masochistic. You can easily vote against who you think is wrong and make things bad for others. It's much more difficult to vote for somebody who is going to be harmful directly to you. Because it's easy to say everybody will suffer rather than I will suffer.
Yeah.
So a political radical is going to be more likely to want to be a martyr. Even on an unconscious level, they'll martyr themselves for unhealthy politics, which is probably why, the collapse, or I guess like Trotsky died. Trotsky gets killed by Stalin. Like, we had to go with Stalin because it was the worst possible way. It was the most painful way. If we had gone with Trotsky, it wouldn't have been radical. It wouldn't have been revolutionary.
Well, also Trotsky having ability to write a book or to talk about eternal revolution and stuff like that is not the same as sort of implementing it. Because you're not trying to convince sort of small intellectual circles. I mean, in a degree you are, but if you're running a country, you got to convince the general public who may not be interested. So you're like average Russian.
Yeah. That's why the greatest thinker we have today is Zizek, because he knows how to influence pop culture and knows how to make people laugh.
I mean, definitely more than any other intellectual right now. I want to know more about Zizek's real reach and numbers. I mean, people can say like, oh, only college students, at best, even know who Zizek is. But there are more.
And he doesn't do any self-publishing, really. All of it's other people forming around him, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's true.
Like the Zizek Times, his official YouTube or whatever, is like, one of his friends puts it together, and I think, and there's just massive. It really bothers me is it's popular to say in leftist circles is like, oh, you don't take. Our fellow mod Joe. Hey Joe, if you're watching, he did the thing. Is taking Zizek seriously was one of his like. It was like, which is worse, actually reading Nick Land or taking Zizek seriously? And he's on our mod spectrum. He might be the furthest left. Him and Riley.
I think Nick Land is one of the most.
But the point being the idea that Zizek is somehow like a sued when he is probably the most accurate analytical thinker.
I don't know if he's I mean, psychoanalytical, but definitely not like Leigh Wittgenstein.
Oh, he's not. Oh, yeah, he's not psychoanalytical. Not, yeah. I guess a better way to put it is he gets to the important points of sort of ideology and underpinnings in a way
Maybe he's the best continental.
Well, he doesn't use the master discourse, which I think is a lot different than your traditional sort of communist, which is you have your general signifiers and your general, okay, let's look at it in this framework, or let's look at it in this framework. Right. Zizek has like a lay psychoanalytical framework, but it's not only in the fact that he looks for unconscious motivation and stuff in the Lacanian sense for the signifiers and for the things that are important in each of the things. And it's not, he doesn't repeat talking points. He actually has in it, when he speaks, he speaks of sort of innovative stuff. And that's what I always admired of him.
I agree. I don't think it is the master's discourse. And that's one of the main reasons he stands out, is that he's never telling people what to do politically. This is part of what is responsible, I think, for Chomsky, even though he's so different. Noam Chomsky's success is how he stood out as a speaker, was that he just talked about history and contemporary history, completely accessible facts. You can go look up in the newspaper, and he didn't say, and that's why you need to vote for so-and-so, or that's why you shouldn't vote, or that's why. He never had any kind of political advice whatsoever. And I think despite how dry he was as a speaker, again, so different from Zizek in so many ways, he still didn't, he was definitely the university discourse. I would say.
Chomsky?
Yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
because he was just like, well, just look at the archives. Just look at the archives. Look at the known, agreed upon facts.
Exactly. It's nothing innovative. It's being good at, there's two types of genius. I forget where I heard this, but there's two types of genius. Those who are really good at doing the expected and those who can do the unexpected. And Chomsky's he is just the best at doing the expected talking points, right? That just fits. Like, how can I fit with it's like if you look at sort of the repressive culture of maybe say like a very left corporation or something. Like say MSNBC you work for, and instead of saying, man, MSNBC, they sort of have this super ego discourse, and you just fucking love it. And that's just your home, is that sort of super ego discourse. And there's people that thrive because they just are so they so identify fully with that, and they don't feel. And then there's other people like Zizek, I would say, who pick it apart. They're the people that pick it apart, and the people that work with the stuff to weave it into, this is what everyone should do. This is the moral answer.
Because Zizek is vulgar, and because in the sense of ugly, but also in the sense of people.
Oh, poor
vulgar because he speaks for the layman, for the person interested in movies and silly books and dirty jokes, rather than somebody who tries to impress people that are already educated. Zizek is vulgar in the best ways, which is why he's a better thinker, because he appeals to humans, to real people.
Yeah. Real people, TM.
He's more entertaining, but also by entertaining, he more effectively is a thinker.
But I think you need all of those. You need Chomsky. You need you need people representing those different discourses so that you can advance them, so that you can turn them. Because if people just had no knowledge, say, of the history of neo-colonial U.S. adventures around the world, it would be very hard to go from there. It would be difficult. But because of someone like Chomsky, there's kind of he's helped perpetuate this knowledge base. But I think that acts as a launching off point for people like Zizek, who can say something actually unexpected. There has to be the expected, so you can say something unexpected. So that's all I'm trying to say.
But it's just, I don't have to worship the fact. Just because it's a natural phenomenon that somebody's going to grab that super ego discourse doesn't mean I can't say, fuck you.
Oh, no. I mean,
right?
you should. You should. And that's the gift Chomsky gives to you, is that you can tell him off, for among other things, being empirically incorrect, in the case of Cambodia, where he sided with the regime there, which was probably...
Are you in an earthquake right now? Well,
are they?
Are you in an earthquake?
It's I'm just on it's just on my knees because I wanted to look at the sun. Sorry.
Oh, gotcha.
That's cool. Not trying to disorient anyone.
Okay.
Is punk the discourse of the hysteric?
Yeah, well, anarchy is traditionally...
Because as you mentioned Cambodia, I think holiday in Cambodia is a laughing denial of that. If you were saying Chomsky sided with the regime, it's sort of a laughing denial of that that university discourse.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's a good song. Oh man, put the computer on this stool and it's just not holding together.
I'm just gonna do this. There we go. You can. No, you don't have to worry about it. Like you were saying, I think I forget if this is Baidu. God, I can't believe I'd be quoting him, but he sort of might be Lacan, I forget. But anarchy is sort of classic discourse of the hysteric, because instead of trying to undermine the master discourse that's affecting you, you're just breaking stuff. But that's saying that assumes that the current system is totally wrong and needs to be overthrown, which I think is a false assumption. Going back to that object A, it goes back to that sort of unrealistic ideal set that sort of the Maoist hardline left sort of have in their heads that, once we overturn capitalism, like you're going to overturn trading value for value. You're not going to overturn that. So once you overthrow capital, then, so we need to actively undermine with an analytic discourse. In some ways it's right, but in other ways, to free the individual, to bring it back to the individual, which is a better sort of take on it. Do you want to submit yourself to a university discourse and just throw out master signifiers that may be very effective in throwing wrenches in the larger machine, or maybe partially, but then what exactly is going to make you happier, right? And that's where that's where nihilism as the flagless object A ideal set can be good to sort of remind yourself that, hey, maybe this master discourse that is being tossed at me is not totally correct.
That's why That's why like ANCOM or ANCAP is doomed to fail because they have flags. True anarchists only have the sticks to hit people with.
Well, where's my flag? I got a flag.
Oh yeah, I've been wanting to see this flag.
There's nothing wrong with the flag. I feel like the flag in and of itself, I got my Sterner flag.
Yeah. Woo!
Oh, there it is. It needs to be tied though.
No.
Got it's a nice safe one. I got it at Target. You can't beat people with it really.
No.
But it can go like
Nice.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's a real fun one.
I love it.
So yeah, this isn't real anarchy, I would say. I would say that's accurate. But it's the one that represents, because I think anarcho-egoism isn't a government proposition. It's just sort of, okay, the government exists. And as Stirner says, I'm already against the next revolution. I believe I'm totally in agreement with him. I'm already against the next revolution, I think is a very important statement. Because when you start from there, and you start from denying the good cause, right? Whose cause should be my own? The good cause. Marx's cause.
Right.
Which is why Marx wrote a book against why he hated Stirner so much. Then you can start to figure out exactly what's important to you. Anybody who tries to tell you that a full alignment with the good cause and the superego discourse is the one you have to fully internally emulate, they're just fucking wrong. And they might not they're not trying to be necessarily manipulative or inaccurate. They're just plain wrong.
Don't you think it's important to entertain ourselves by having political movements, though? Like, it's important to change things. It's important to take political action for the purpose of amusement. And for the purpose
amusement, if it helps, I would say you can't fully be amused unless you really think it's going to help in some way. Like, for instance,
I completely disagree. You can enjoy doing the wrong thing.
Well, I had the idea. I had the idea that I want to vote, but because my vote doesn't matter, I want to vote for the opposite of everything I want to vote for. And I feel like that would be a much more personally fulfilling thing to do.
And it's entertaining, and that's doing the wrong thing because it doesn't matter. But I think that's a very important thing, is that if you say all political action has to be sincere, then you deny like nearly all political action. It's only like these public revolutionaries that are honest about even then there's probably a lack in their personal beliefs. But like it's very dangerous that there's a precedent set for essentially everybody to be highly opinionated. It's become a sin to not care.
Yeah.
Like in the old days, or I guess that's why everybody's not cool now. That's why we don't have any cool counterculture movements, because everybody cares. And if you care, you are mainstream. A real counterculture.
I feel I'm too nihilist. As for me, I relate to Rick because Rick is nihilist. Anyway, I'll stop.
But even Rick cares. He cares about progress. He cares about science, even if it's selfish.
Well, but he cares about it because it allows him to do stuff, right? That's
There's all will to power with Rick, I feel like.
Yeah.
He has a daughter, though. He cares about his daughter.
Yeah, but he has infinite daughters, Chris. Doesn't, that precludes emotional intimacy, as he
cares about
said.
the ideal of the daughter.
Yeah, well, none of us are perfect, right?
Otherwise, he wouldn't replicate the family so efficiently in each alternate universe.
Well, right. I mean, that's the underlying symptomatic, what undermines his professed, right, cynicism through the whole show is that, like, they're always, and they're playing with that. That's like the thing, that's one of their themes they play with. They're like, but he has Morty around. Why does he do that? And then they're like, in this episode, it shows how Morty is just there as a shield, and it's just, it's actually for a pragmatic reason. And you're like, wow, he really is just evil. And then, like, and they keep switching back and forth with that.
So I have a question. To avoid getting too far down the Rick and Morty discourse.
Too late.
So if Elliot 2, if there was another infinite amount of Elliots, I have a question. If there's another Elliot who had your exact same experiences and your exact same self, if you knew that only one of you could live in this, how quickly would you kill him? Would you be able to kill the other Elliot?
How would I know that only one of us could live? How would I know that?
That's a good question.
Doesn't that imply that you're already smarter? If he has had the same exact experiences up until that point, you're already better. Up
until that point.
I mean, if the other Elliot believed that was true, then I would definitely feel justified in killing him because he would be trying to kill me. So, if...
So here's a question.
Yes.
I would say it's a fair assumption to say a second you with your exact same experiences but is outside yourself isn't you.
Obviously, it's not me.
It's not you. It's a second person. So, in a way, there is sort of an infinite amount of us's in that I'm perceived as the other to you. I'm also perceived as the other to Chris. And my girlfriend's over there doing work. So there's an infinite amount of me. So why do we care if those others function properly? Why do we need others to see ourselves? They're a second set of ourselves, but they are not ourselves because we are the thing in and of ourselves.
Power, because there can only, like, we'll use the concept of twins. There can only be one real twin when there are identical twins. And they will either lose identity completely, or they will have to fight it out for supremacy.
Or they have two separate identities. I see that happen all the time with identical twins. It's like this identical twins into this thing. This one's the alternative one.
To be around each other all the time.
Yeah.
But when they're young, when they're in school, when they're still living together.
Well, but I mean, if people are, I mean, that is a problem. Supposedly, that I hear about, from the stories of identical twins. But it seems like most of them are pretty sad when the other one goes away or dies. They're like, wow, that was like the closest friend I could ever possibly have. Like, they'll never have a relationship as close and mutually understanding, is what they believe. Maybe that's not true.
They should plan suicides ahead of time. That way they can die happy.
Nihilism.
No, see, that's the opposite. I'm trying to help them. I'm trying to get to the happiest point possible. I'm trying to get to the most meaningful death for these twins. What is Gemini without another? What's Gemini without the other twin? Nothing.
Who knows? Maybe they'll be the fucking. They'll be the best. I don't know.
Yeah, like Remus and Romulus? There can only be one. Or, of course, Twin Peaks. There can only be one doppelganger in the world.
Yeah, it'd be a double coup.
One in the real world.
I like this idea that there is an infinite amount of us's, and I'm talking to the Elliot Chris. Because it really is true. and I'm also talking to the Elliot,
Right.
right? Because I'm not really talking to the Chris Elliot. I'm also not talking to. So in a way, we do have these infinite amounts of resources or secondary selves that are in, but they exist in the other.
Right.
So I think how do we I think we need to mindfully recognize that ourselves and the other is not ourselves, and I think there can be sort of possibly.
It's kind of like every one of you is just the archetypal you. It's sort of you. All the yous exist in the archetypal realm. It exists in the collective unconscious, because I wouldn't imagine that you are going to see yourself that far from yourself. You're still going to fit the same basic patterns.
But look at all the alt-rics. All the alt-rics are different.
But they all wear the same white and blue coat.
And they're all into science, and but they're different.
Their
Yeah,
hair.
they have different hair. Their hair is different.
But that's such a superficial thing. Their clothing in a cartoon, it's funny because it's the opposite of real life. And in clothing in a cartoon is the most real thing, because your face can morph, but your clothing doesn't. In a cartoon, your face can bend, mold, but in the clothing stays the same. Or a superhero, the outfit's always the same.
There is a solid symbolic order, but the problem with that is in the other, the symbolic order can represent totally different stuff. Like once you pick apart stuff, me seeing graphic tees means one thing to me and another thing to another person. For instance, me the Elliot, this Elliot, the 1L1T Elliot, most efficient way to spell Elliot.
Story of my life.
You're a utilitarian Elliot. Elliot with two L's is a romantic.
It's true.
It's surplus Elliot.
True.
Surplus value Elliot.
Surplus enjoyment.
I know, that's true.
Come on, when you're writing in cursive, you want to do more loops. You know it.
I think we left.
Fuck, what was I going to say?
Yeah, I don't know.
That made me forget. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so the symbolic order of possibly me being a therapist or that is sort of like the cartoon outfit. But it doesn't stay the same. It's not the same for everybody because people have different unconscious relations to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So how do we utilize this infinite nature of ourselves? We are infinite. We have our singular selves, but we are infinite in that we are infinite in others. But we're not technically infinite. We could add it all up, and there would be a fine, exact number of people that know who we are.
Right. But there's an open set of possible selves, images of ourselves.
Yeah.
It's open. It's not infinite in the sense of mathematically infinite, but it's open.
And then you can go to the human, but then you can go to the animal. Then I can suddenly stand over an anthill, blah, and not crush it. And then all the ants go like this, and bam, open set. But it's not a human open set. But I still am otherized in the other, just based off their ability to perceive in some degree. Right. I feel like working in schools, I'm really attuned to it. When you're assigned an authority role.
Yeah.
Like, I was a student my whole life. You're a student your whole life, and then 3 years ago they arbitrarily go, "Oh, by the way, you're the faculty now." It's like, what? It's kind of like being a mod in the group or whatever, or being like suddenly like that. That's what happened when I made this group. It was like I shit post in all the groups, and then suddenly I'm in charge of a group. But then in a more profound way, you're a student, and then you're on the faculty. So now you're playing this role out, and you can see the huge difference it makes. Yourself as this secondary role, as this faculty sort of a role that I have with like students. It's like it's a total sea change. It's the self, the infinite self that is reproduced in the minds of the other who see me as a faculty member is totally different than
right. And so much of that is determined by the symbolic order, right? Your place in the order, and their relationship, the student's relationship to the order, not to you, because their perception of those roles, their historical relationship to various roles of authority determines so strongly how, especially initially, they perceive you as a person. And so that's this massive mediating force. So it's like, yeah, you get to have an open, theoretically infinite set of yourselves, but it gets mediated through all these different structures and things. So
And I think with all those infinite sets, we have to go back. We have to remember our original question, which is an exact copy of yourself outside of yourself? No.
Elliot,
Yeah, obviously.
I think that's important to remember, because then we can utilize these secondary images of ourselves as we need to. And it's not it's not like we're being false. It's that we recognize the self and the other is not necessarily ourselves.
Right.
as a
It's kind of like memes, because you put memes out in the world, and it's like, you know, you make them and you put them out there. They're not you, but they're a little impression. They're little impressions you're leaving in the world.
A vague shadow of the thing in of itself, but not quite the thing in of itself.
as a counselor, do you hide your power level from the students?
Depends on the student.
Do you act like one of them, or do you fully take on your symbolic power?
No, definitely not. I always relieve myself of the authority role. I always feel like that's I do have the authority role, and I recognize, I say, listen, this is my authority role. This is what I have to report, which is ethically what you're supposed to do. You go, okay, so this is what I report. You tell me anything related to this, I report it to DCFS, or report it to the principal or whatever. And so I start there, and I say, I always try to make it clear that it's like my job. I see my job as to help you in your self-interest. I'm not interested in working outside of your self-interest. I want to be, I'm sort of like, I always feel like if I'm working in a way that isn't benefiting the student, I'm not doing my job. So I want to make that very clear. So in a way, I don't take my authority and I don't impose it on the student. What I say is, I'm an authority figure in some degree. You may have got sent to me because you're getting in trouble, but then I'll try to frame, it's like, let's see. So this is what happens when you do this. And it's like, and it's ultimately your choice. I'm not going to act as an authority figure, be like, oh, that's a bad job. Oh, you did this bad thing, and now that's a bad. I go, well, how does, what do you, is that a consequence you don't think matters? And usually it's not, because, it's a lot of stuff happens. Be like, let's look at this practically. You have the choice to do this, and the outcome before you do this. Yeah. You really do, if you think about it. Right. So then you have to decide what's right for you. That's why I say my secret name for my modality is dialectical egoist therapy, because I always start with the client's values, and the dialectic is the individual and the collective, or the individual and society at large. And that's what I try to work with someone. I get their value sets with the value tree thing, which sounds stupid and basic, but it's really important because I don't want to impose my values on them. So I get their value set, a brief shadow impression of their values, right? And then we work from there on their self-interest. So which I think is always so funny, because I'm such a tyrant in the mod, in the group. But it always bothers me when people are like, oh, are you a tyrant there? It's like, no. Yeah. It's like I'm quite the opposite. I'm like, I really want to strengthen people and make the world a place that is possible.
I mean moderating a meme group, it's the stakes are very different.
Yeah, exactly. It's a totally different environment, Do
your patients know you're a meme master?
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. No.
That would be inappropriate, because then they could.
That's also why I have a fake name, so people can't.
Yeah.
So like students can't Google me, and then.
That's what I figured when you changed it. I was like, oh, he's being strategic there.
It's kind of like what's it called? It's kind of like with Carl Jung, like we know in the page, everybody is like, oh, crystal ball. He because he was honest, and he chose to show his true interest and his unconscious. He revealed his unconscious in the Red Book, and so he is now fated to be Crystal Ball Man rather than repressing.
I gotta get my power cord, because. Sorry, I'll be right back. I have 4 minutes remaining on my
Jung gave up his power by choosing to show who he was.
Well, I mean, it wasn't just the Red Book. I mean, he wrote, and I haven't read all of it, but my impression of Aeon is that part of it is a genealogy of the morality of the Christian faith, and then another part of it is like all just about astrology, and like, and it's like it's all mixed together.
It's not just it's like it's Aeon, it's Psychology and Alchemy, Mysterium Conjunctionis, like all of his late work. Answer to Job is like a massive one because like a lot of theologians consider it to be like the most bizarre Christian exegesis ever written because it's like there's not a trinity, there's a quaternion, and the fourth part of God is evil, is pure evil, and it's really interesting. It's a book worth reading.
I love Jung. Oh, he's great. Yeah, no, but it's just interesting because as you go, at the beginning of the book is just like, here's maybe why there's this repressed shadow in Christendom because of the history of arguments and attitudes towards what evil is, where evil comes from, and then it just goes further and further down the rabbit hole, and I think that's very interesting, even though the rest of that stuff is not as accessible to me, it's not as meaningful to me. It's still, I appreciate that he does put that all out there.
When I read Nick Land, he reminds me
Peterson talks about
of a lot of very strange Jung's, like the most bizarre Jungian work reminds me of Land.
Really?
Like,
yeah.
Their method of analysis, while not using the same terms, they essentially both trace the lineage through the strain. You know, they don't always take the regular path. They take the most bizarre path and the path that will give the most depth to something.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, and I have a hard time following Land a lot of the time.
I think Land has a hard time following Land a lot of the time.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. And I don't know. I mean,
well, he's a delusium. Land is at heart. He's an investigator of the multiplicity and the effects and the both causal and affect things, the mutual sort of effect and the webs of things that attach each other. So his stuff, I would say, he's not necessarily trying to make a cohesive point all the time.
I definitely don't think
I think what he's doing is he's mapping rhizomes and mapping multiplicities. And if you look at the back of Fangnomena, I don't know if you saw that I posted in our Land fan club, or the anarcho accelerationist memes for egoist teams. Yeah, but his map, which is, he takes a spinal column and then he extrapolates. And then he maps out every association he has with it. Mm-hmm. Then people will be like, well, what's he saying here? It's like, well, he's not. It's like he's associating and he's trying to map all the multiplicities possible within this singular thing, and he's really good at it because that's his main modality, right? Is Deleuze-Guattari.
It feels more like an atlas or an archive, and if you wanted to say something particular, you could use his ideas to say it, but the sensation of like acceleration and speed that's in Land is very palpable, and yet, it doesn't go anywhere specific. It doesn't land at a conclusion.
Well, it's intrinsically fanged, right? It doesn't go anywhere, but it does tear down things and let you see. It does negate,
right.
To go to Hegel, God through negation. He negates all these intrinsic concepts, and that's why I think Dark Enlightenment, even though it's a neo-reactionary sort of racist work, is so worth reading because he goes to the very core of Western values that are passed left and right, just the essence of sort of the glue that holds our humanistic values set together.
But the idea of a false, the idea of the myth of enlightenment being a myth is extremely important. Like that is not just ideology. The Enlightenment is honestly a completely fictitious idea.
What's a marketing?
So it's so important to know. So that's one of the most important ideas, is that logic and reason are completely lacking.
Yeah. Well, it's like what separates the Enlightenment from the high medieval period? It certainly isn't the quality of philosophers. I think what it is the democratic revolutions.
Right.
I think that's where the line in the sand is drawn. Is we had monarchy as the only system,
Yes.
and then we had the American Revolution and the seeds of the American Revolution.
Are you
And then
ready
we
for a
had the French
hot take?
Revolution. And then, that's towards, maybe the tail end of the Enlightenment. But still, that's what it leads to. Sort of led to, okay, so we're going to be free. What are we tyrannized by? Well, we're tyrannized by the king. Okay,
Right.
that makes sense. You are tyrannized by the king. That's what kings do. They inflict symbolic order singularly.
Right.
So then they say the answer is democracy. Well, we've seen the fruits of that. And in a way, there is freedom of speech. So there's a lot of positives from democracy, but it has its own inflictions, and that's what Zizek is so great at pointing out, is that democracy is not necessarily a creator of great happiness. It's just the sort of void.
We
Back.
cannot be rid of the archetypal leader, king, ruler, emperor. It's impossible. Just as much as man or woman, we have an emperor. Regardless of whether or not we choose, it doesn't matter if we choose him, we are constantly desiring the archetypal leader.
Yeah, well, we can't be free of the desire, maybe, but we can't be free of the actual governmental structure. I mean, that's why the void of a democratic republic is so fragile, because at any time the public could coalesce around an imperial dictatorial figure, because there's nothing about the system that necessarily prevents that.
But that goes with that, like, oh, logic and reason may not be natural, but they're still the best way of doing things. Like, that's a very weak point. Not that your point is weak, but that generally to say, like, oh, it may not, it's not permanent, it's not the best, but we can still do it. Like, yeah, we can do a lot of things, and you can believe in a lot, but why not go with something that is sturdy? Why not go with something that will gain power? Like, I think it's funny because we think about democracy as being very easy to change, but it's not. Monarchies are really easy to change because all you have to do is know how to kill them. Yeah. If you can kill the king, you can be the king. Is that not true democracy? It's an aristocratic democracy. If you have the power to kill them, then you can be the leader.
I want to talk about that interesting poster Elliot has. Don't fuck cops. That is
It's a patch.
Well, it's a patch. Well, it can mean it could mean either you like the symbol. It can mean don't say fuck cops.
Yeah.
But it can also mean don't have sex with cops.
Pretty sure that's what it means.
Or it can mean both.
Yeah.
It means don't pervert the symbolic order, but also don't give in to them. Don't pervert the symbolic order. Don't punch it, but don't let it make love to you.
And yet, the symbolic order is upheld by that sort of implemented idea of, like, oh, a man in a uniform is attractive, but that's a totally new thing. That's like a modern propaganda piece.
I don't know about that.
I guarantee you.
That's a pretty ancient one.
What do you? All right. Well, here. What you know about bacon and eggs for breakfast? It's the traditional American breakfast, but it was created by Bernays in the 30s.
Yeah, but uniforms aren't new.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Uniforms are like...
Finding the man in uniform attractive is new.
Well,
maybe that statement.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I don't think... I think part of the appeal, always, of going to war has been sold to people because then you're a hero, and you come back and you went out and fought for your land or your people or your king, and that makes you, like, that elevates you. Something like I'm pretty sure that's always been a part of organized warfare.
And yet, most of the time, when they go off to war, their wives cheat. That's like a pretty consistent pattern.
Well, I think it's
most of the time.
Yes, it's like a mass.
That hot stat.
I think I think this is more of an appeal to young unmarried men who feel like, how do I get the woman? How do I get the wife? And it's like, well, you have to do something worth something, you piece of shit. Go kill somebody, you know. Go put on the uniform, earn it. You know, you might die.
I'm saying don't do it.
But who
don't maintain that pattern is that patch.
That is, yes, that is what it's saying.
But can you not? You can't avoid it in some degree. But I think you can avoid becoming a tool of the state and the superego and the punisher of the society at large. I think you can't avoid doing that and maintaining a symbolic order that inflicts on the others. But Thiel says every speech is an imposition. You know, you're imposing stuff onto the other every time you talk. So to talk to someone, to interact with someone, is to do a violence to them.
To speak is to lie. Everyone is a coward in the face of the Nova ovens.
So we can't escape inflicting on the other, but we can escape being an actual, you know, we can. If someone has a monopoly on violence and cops have a monopoly on violence, we cannot be a cop. That's possible.
Right. Yeah.
I honestly feel terrible for cops. I think I don't. They have fully internalized the superego in the symbolic order. I feel like that's very psychically damaging and very difficult to. So I don't have contempt.
I was just watching Cops.
Even though I've personally been beat up by a cop, and I still don't feel contempt for cops.
I was watching the show, and one of the cop was saying like, "Oh, I didn't really want to be a cop, but I think it's something that law enforcement will choose you. You don't choose it." So that really goes along with it. Like, you've so totally embodied the superego that it's like it is God.
Yeah, it elects you. Yeah.
That's like what's called. There's that goes literally with a superhero. You know the Spectre?
Sort of.
The Spectre is the vengeance of God, and it will pick its host, and he will then have to go out and do the will of God.
Yikes.
Sounds Dostoevsky. Reminds me of.
Yeah.
Reminds me of Crime and Punishment.
Ooh.
The Spectre through the will of God, and then the Raskolnikov writes about. He goes, oh, and he sort of has his own view of the Uberman. In it, and then they go, so Raskolnikov, are you the Uberman? And Raskolnikov goes, no. But then the argument is, oh, Raskolnikov, if you write it, you can't help it. While you're writing it, you think of yourself a little like the Uberman. You think of yourself like this. You can't help but to put yourself in that position of the highest symbolic order, the greatness, right?
You mean
so that was
even
ultimate there, when they were like, oh, did you commit the crime, Raskolnikov? You know, and they're like, of course he did.
Right.
Of course he put himself as that ultimate decider of life and death.
Right.
You know, in the same way a cop does that. Even though they follow basic rules, they put themselves in that position. Their definition of overman is a decider of life and death. And I think there's different ways that your symbolic order can, be imposed on the other, but you don't have to be a cop necessarily.
See, we could get rid of the Platonic philosopher king, as long as we had philosopher cops.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I love that. That's a great idea.
That is definitely what we have, though. I mean, there's definitely like a Nietzschean undertone to a lot of cop TV shows, which I have a strong suspicion that a lot of cops watch cop TV shows, despite how inaccurate I'm sure they are in so many ways to the actual experience of law enforcement. I have a strong suspicion. I would like it to be investigated that they watch them, but it's such a trope. It's a cliche of the cop who is trying to do good, But to do good, he has to do bad. He has to break the law, and he has to go beyond the law, beyond good and evil, to enforce the order. And even
To
though
enforce the ultimate good.
yeah, and it's to
Right.
enforce the ultimate good, so it's not entirely Nietzschean, but there's a flirtation with that logic, which is that he, rather than others, has to, maybe it's more just like Dostoevsky, he has to take on the moral responsibility and taint himself with evil to ensure that the flock and the rest of humanity can be safeguarded and stuff. But there's
Dirty
a way,
Hans.
huh?
Dirty Hans.
I don't know who that is.
No, rather
You mean
Dirty
like
Harry. You have the Ubermensch.
Oh,
I was
sorry.
gonna say like little Hans. Like what? Oh, or is that just because his name is? All right, never mind.
Yeah, but there's a flirtation with that idea that they've been kind of anointed or whatever, and their duty is to kind of be above or beyond humanity and its norms and rules. So I think that's.
Well, Jung talks about that in The Undiscovered Self a lot. He talks about how dictators completely embody the people rather than, they may go in initially like, oh, I'm going to take, I'm going to get power for myself. I'm going to do this for me. I'm going to get what I want. But in the end, or if they start to believe the propaganda and they start to actually act out the will of the people, they are so totally lost that there's no individuality left. They become that cop that goes beyond good and evil. They abandon themselves to do the will of the people. That's why no evil matters.
Well, this is why Jung is so cool, because this is an inversion of the how people normally talk about this, which is that people start out idealistic and then power corrupts them. And he's not saying that power isn't corrupting them, but it's in precisely the opposite direction, right?
Which power purifies them.
Yeah, right. Which
purifies them in like the political sense, like, oh, we want a politician that does what we want, but it's like, no, you don't. You want a politician that doesn't do what you want.
Right. Well, I would object and say you can't have a politician that does what the people want, because there's two. What does that mean? Like, which people and when, and
once you get a collective that is focused on one thing, that is the people. And even if an individual doesn't agree with it, they still agree with it. And so when you have,
yeah, but
I think there's a very important thing. There's a very important thing that I have to interject about, which is, there's this really old campaign. I mean, important is relative, probably to me specifically. Yeah. There's this old campaign. It's like, you heard the old theory, the man makes the office. When Trump was like, this isn't true. That's why I have to vote against my party, because this man is unfit for office, right? And the Democrats sort of retook that old ad and applied it to Trump, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the problem with Trump is power didn't purify him in any degree, because he had it already. He already had the power, and he became powerful in a business sense, and the extra power of government did not dramatically shift him versus a senator. A senator is a very, very, very different thing than a president.
Right.
A senator has a semblance of power, but the power of a president is worldwide.
Right.
The power of a senator is like, okay, your state. But if you're the president of the United States, you essentially dictate terms for the world in a lot of ways. So power. I think power. The phrase that power purifies I think there's something very true about it, and I think it happens to everyone as they grow older. Because when you're a child, you are put into the role of the child. Mm-hmm. And your power is taken away from you, and you're fed lessons. You're fed lessons, and then you sort of drastically get pushed. You get pushed into the young adult. So okay, now you're a young adult, past teenage years or whatever, or past your initial childhood, and then you get pushed into adult, sort of. So then you fully have to. Okay, so you've gotten these lessons. And you're sort of a vague nihilist, and you sort of fuck around with stuff. And then when you're given responsibility, suddenly you have some sort of moral code. Or like Peterson says, he always avoids, Peterson's much more responsible than me, but he has a bigger audience as well. Also, he's an actual professor. But he says he always avoids taking on that leader archetype because he knows it's intrinsically false. There's something like Chris was saying, you guys were both saying earlier, that sort of leader archetypes gets taken through. There's always a new leader that's sort of found, because the archetype works through different people, right? So, but once you're given power as an adult, once you're given power as sorting yourself out and like figuring out a life plan, there's a Peterson's whole thing. It seems sort of basic because he is, the secret of Peterson is he's very triangle. He is very behaviorist. He talks to Piaget. He loves Piaget. Behaviorist. He's a behaviorist.
He's a super behaviorist. He is.
And but it's based not on just basically, oh, don't feel bad. So it's not very stupid behaviorism. It has deep rooted reasons for.
Oh yeah, it's the whole school. He's going back to the old days.
But he's taking you from childhood, the initial lostness of childhood, and by imposing this symbolic order that's rooted in a sort of society, he's purifying you by giving you power, even though it looks like he's taking away power.
Right.
By the sort of the taking on of the symbolic order, you become powerful and you become morally centered. Peterson talks about he's a sober person now. Much like me, and which means at one point he was a Dionysian.
Right.
And there's a responsibility for some reason, although it's not a very A to B obvious thing. It's like there's some set of taking on the moral set that sobriety does, or sort of taking on these archetypes or these symbolic order roles to make you a more purely moral being in a way.
Well, you also have to think about how it's very easy to fail at any one of those transitions.
Oh yeah.
Like I would say, this generation has lost the transition from young adult to adult. There's no sublimation. Like you were talking about, like marriage, how it used to be like, okay, like what Peterson said, less terror. I'm going to be with this person, so I don't have to be terrified. But we are constantly terrified now, because the only ideal that has given us comfort it's not been shattered yet, or it's been shattered so much that we refuse to accept the other.
Yeah.
No, you go. Sorry.
Oh no, it's just interesting the contrast between having, and I don't mean it in the propagandistic sense, but having privilege versus having power and thus responsibility. Because you can have all these niceties. You can be like, well, I'm not going to starve. I have a roof, all these things. But it doesn't mean that you're aware of how your decisions affect the world or other people or things into the future, and thus power. And so if people have this sense, everyone talks about the extended adolescence, and it's the sense that, well, yeah, you can get a job, and that's just like so you can make some money and get a nicer apartment or something. But that's just like, it's just all argued from hedonism. It's just like, oh, it'll be better for you. And so, oh, you're responsible to yourself, and that's it, because of your really limited influence and power. It's like, well, take care of yourself, but that's it. You don't have dependence. You don't have this. You don't have a responsibility to the future because the world's just dying anyway, and just all this stuff.
Which I feel like is totally irrelevant, because is it dying in the next 60 years? Like, if it dies after I'm dead, it just doesn't.
No, but you don't understand. It's about the narrative relevance, because if you have the progressive narrative of civilization ever improving itself, and you really believe that, you can be like, well, my responsibility is to be a part of that process. But if you're like, well, gosh, that was just a narrative, and it's not necessarily true, and therefore when someone says, yeah, you don't have responsibilities now, and you're not going to have kids because that's optional and all this stuff. But what about the future? All you have abstractly is the future, and then you're like, well, but is that even?
That's terrible.
We've come full
That's so
circle.
sad and so true, because you take away the traditional archetypes of you're fostering growth and another thing, and traditionally that'll be the family, and then you take it away from people, and it becomes
Is nihilism the denial of the archetypal reality?
I think nihilism, I don't think it's a denial of the, I think it can be the opposite. The extra valuation is the denial of archetypal reality. I think nihilism brings you into the unconscious and makes you more susceptible to archetypal roles.
Hmm. But it denies. It denies the real. It denies the reality of the archetypes. Like, it's to say, like what you were saying, it is leaving yourself vulnerable to them. But if you say, God is dead, the king is dead, the king, there's no power in the king, that just opens you up to having any king, any archetypal king, or any archetypal god, because you deny the reality of the archetype. You leave yourself open to it.
The author is dead, and there is no unitary self, and on and on.
I hate that phrase, the death of the author. I think that's such bullshit.
Like, we're killing gender now, but that just leaves
I mean, it's important. It's an important phrase. I think the death of the author isn't a very important phrase, but you create something, you fucking take ownership of it. That's yours. That's your own. Like, why would you want to like writing something is so that you should take yourself away, so it's just the writing? Fuck, fuck that. Take ownership. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because that phrase is always used in reference to other people's writing. Just like when you say the death of God, obviously that refers to a god, the gods, whatever. It's not about you. And the phrase death of the author is the same way. It's about these people that can't tell you what they meant, and therefore, but you're right, it does reflect back on you in a way. So that's a really interesting point. I've never thought about it in that sense.
It's a very irresponsible thing. Like, a lot of people think they can be anarchists or nihilists, but they don't understand that you have to understand why. Like we have a lot of people that are like, oh, masculine and feminine are simply gender roles, simply social constructs, but they don't understand there's an unconscious reality to them, and that you can say they're gender roles, but can you tell me about Kali? Like, can you tell me about Mary? Can you tell me about personal? Like, where do you see gender in history? Where do you see gender in myth and religion? You give no context to gender, thus you don't understand it at all. We believe in gender only as the market construct. Just like when people talk about books, I'm sure they're thinking about Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, rather than the Nag Hammadi, rather than the Vedic hymns or
the Bible even.
Anything. They're not talking about books. They're talking about what you find on a store rack. They're talking about magazines. Or when they talk about God, they're not talking about the face that appeared to Brother Klaus or the vision that Moses received. They're talking about going to church every Sunday and eating bread and wine and acting happy and singing. They don't understand the context and the reality of the archetype. They only understand the very, very minimal existence in their own life. They deny the...
Well, how could you understand something beyond its existence in your mind? I mean, that's the...
Well, you can understand it with the unconscious, because it has unconscious values.
Yeah, but you don't have direct access to the unconscious.
But by reading older things...
Interpretation of dreams, my guy.
You can get access by reading things.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's no way, but it's definitely, I mean, it's, for instance, proposed by people like Jung and Freud that it's difficult and takes a lot of interpretive work, and you probably can't do it by yourself. So
that's why we shouldn't just deny the concepts outright, because it's difficult.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, but mostly people don't deny them. They just don't, you're right, they don't understand them, but like, there's no room in me for derision about that, because if you don't understand why something's important, why would you embrace it. To me,
You
that
want to hear what direct access to the unconscious sounds like?
yes.
Okay. This is direct access to let's see. I go because this is not something I could consciously think of. I go to the this is from a dream. I go to the lunchroom and the workers are elderly. I put $1 on a card and I say it's from a trust fund, which I don't have, as the source, and they swipe and say, from a trust fund. My supervisor tells me she is at the bus, so I go to leave, and I have one of my notebooks. I have notebooks that I can't leave. They have all my client information. I have one of my notebooks, but the other one I left by the students' area. There's an overall void I am escaping that the bus leaving saves me from.
Nice.
And it was a fairly dark dream because I dreamed that I was like escaping from a school shooter.
Wow.
But instead of guns, they had these big cardboard boxes.
Weird. That's really weird.
Maybe that's
So it's like
maybe it's a
yeah.
fear of being fired.
No.
You're given a box. You're given a box
from
to
this
pack
internship.
your things and leave.
What?
You're given
Sorry.
a box when you are fired.
That's true. No, but they had the box. The students had empty boxes. The shooters had empty boxes.
Interesting.
Right.
It's like your dream censored the weapon. It's like we'll just put a box around this.
Or it's because I don't think they really I think there's when you do counseling for students, there's always I think the archetype of for me in my head of the Elliot Rodgers type.
Yeah.
I think despite not actually working with an Elliot Rodgers or anything like that.
Well, I
think
guess you live right in California. You live where he came from.
Oh yeah, Santa Barbara. I've been there. I've been where he drove.
For incels, it's like the holy trail that you can take.
Jesus.
That's dark, man. That's real dark.
It's not that much. They use ER is like the religious term for the incels.
Yeah.
Just like for Crowleyans, they say 93, or for Nazis they say 1488. For incels, it's ER.
What's funny is the other counselor that I work with currently, his last name is Rogers.
Ooh.
And so there's a sign and it has both our names and it has Elliot and then blank, and then it has my last name, then his first name, and then Rogers.
Shit. That's interesting. Oh my god.
What do you think you could have done to help an Elliot Rodgers if he had come into your office?
I think I legitimately I've always thought this could speak to my arrogance. I've always thought that he would never done that shit if he had me as his therapist. He wouldn't have. I just know it. I just know it.
But incels are like the plague of our generation. Like everybody is an incel. Or I mean, like we have a lot of incels. You know what I mean? Like it's a hidden majority. It's a hidden majority in a way because the internet covers up reality covers up our lost boys and girls. The internet shows them for what they are, and we have.
As we grow up, I feel like there's always the archetype of the incel, and then you grow up, and then you can't always have sex when you want. So there's sort of the archetype as the incel that I think is very relatable to people's insecurities.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying archetype.
Yeah, truly.
Point.
It's kind of
like the cop is the archetype of the punishing superego.
I would say the incel is the reverse magician.
A reverse magician.
Somebody who has no control at all. Because Ryder says that the reverse magician, one of the main corresponding things is mental illness or mental problems. So it's a lack of control. It's derangement.
So people pull him out of a hat.
Yes.
Yeah.
He is the rabbit. He is the one who lacks any control over his situation. An incel, because they're involuntary.
Right. No, I know what it means. I wish I didn't know.
No, but that's good a clarification because involuntary is a good point.
But I mean, like to say like for the magician, everything he does is voluntary. In fact, Aleister Crowley says, you're a magician even if you intentionally blow your nose. That's still magic because you will. Versus somebody who acts on only involuntary stuff. Like they are completely incapable of controlling their life. And thus an incel is the reversed magician.
Right. But there's some level at which both of those are, I would say, delusory. Like, people who feel they have no control, they're obviously wrong. They have some marginal control.
Yeah.
And the same goes for the magician who is now doing magic just for themselves even, which is that they feel that everything that's happening, it's almost psychosis, is like an extension of their will. Like, that's obviously not true either. Even if they're very skilled at manipulation and things, and they can transfix an audience and actually assert their will in all these ways. It's not, neither image is as complete as whatever the archetype suggests, I think.
Jung talks about it in Aeon, about how the will of God, like in law, is a very important thing. It's like, what do we say is the reason for involuntary actions or situations that we had no control over? And like, I'm not going to go into it all, but it's in the chapter The Self. It's it's really good. It taught but he basically says like the will of God has to be maintained. Like we have to believe in it, or that not even that we have to, but that we will, because it does so many important things. It's an important idea to be able to allocate some of your actions onto the unconscious, even if you don't say it. You say it's God, or you say it's nature,
right?
You say it's impulses, but in reality, it's the unconscious.
Right. Well, you mean because the alternative would be to take on responsibility.
Either to take on responsibility or to blame individuals or organizations. A much more psychotic, because arguably it's more psychotic to deny, or I guess to impose systems onto things that you actually interact with, rather than say, oh, it's nature or it's God, or it's a very vague idea. You can really say anything about it without seeming crazy. We can say anything about an idea. You can't say anything about a person without coming off as crazy.
Yeah, or the post office, or the CIA, or something.
I always find it interesting that people in psychosis talk about the same stuff. That, what that says to me is they're following a symbolic order. They're not out of the symbolic. Why do psychotic people talk about the New World Order and the Illuminati all the time?
Well,
are all those people psychotic?
That's what my book is all about. That's what I'm writing all about.
Not all of them. If you vaguely reference, like, okay, there's people that have a lot of power and they sort of have, but if you there's a vague element of psychosis to the Alex Jones globalist conspiracy, like they were saying, the total control, the idea, because the way I see it is, I always saw that type as one kind of person, which is this is a person that would rather have that the entire world is ordered by an evil force than the reality, which is it's a void.
Right.
And that again is the reversed magician. That's the political incel.
Yeah.
They're the incel.
Alex Jones is the political incel. Oh my God, that's funny.
But that's what I'm writing all about. I'm writing all about that. That's what my conspiracy book is about. Yeah. It's about what the New World Order means, what the 9/11 conspiracies, moon landing conspiracies, etc. But they are all deeply symbolic. And I think it's interesting you said like they're all following the same symbolic order. Perhaps it's because the symbolic order is essentially based on unconscious archetypes, that they are one of the same.
Even in psychosis, they can't escape the archetype of the psychotic. Isn't that awful? I feel.
Did you ever, They Might Be Giants?
All I know is Istanbul, not Constantinople.
They did a song called The Shadow Government. The Shadow Government.
Really? I haven't heard that one.
It's got a great line, and it's, driving home from my meth lab, I realized something had changed, and I looked in the sky, and I saw that the moon is following me. So you literally have this constant unconscious influence.
Right.
The moon the unconscious is constantly influencing the psychotic. And the symbols of psychosis have never changed. It's just their content. Like in the past, we talked with angels and demons. We were influenced by angels and demons. Now it's aliens. That's the main thesis of my work, is that they fulfill the same role. Angelos, messenger, versus alien as other. It's in fact, alien is much more empty, because aliens can be both good and evil, whereas angels and demons fulfill very distinctive roles.
Right.
That's an important part of the postmodern thoughts that we have, that a psychotic now is in a lot worse of a situation than the psychotic in the religious time, because now every enigma, every symbol has both good and evil, rather than there being an objective good or objective evil that they can rely on.
Right. Well, to me, what's interesting about the what did you say? What you were saying, Other Elliot, about the they'd rather believe that the whole world is controlled by this malevolent force than that it's a void, or that it's just out of control. But that's this funny inverse of like the religious worldview, where everything is God's will and part of the plan, God's plan. And
so God is chaos, but God is also order. But in that we can't understand God.
He's the greater order.
Yeah.
From which we can't see, but people who aren't by themselves in a basement 99% of the time say this to each other in buildings called church, and it's an affirmation that this bad thing happened, but good things are going to come out of it. But it's basically the metaphysical good version of that evil conspiracy world. And so to me, it does seem like that evil conspiracy viewpoint is maybe a modern phenomena, in the sense that materialism is just, more convincing than just talking about angels and stuff, if you really get down to it. And so even though the
hyper-information age,
as the hyper-information age, you can always get more information to connect the dots. And even though it's not scientifically rigorous, it still is making reference to real stuff in the world. And so it feels, more reassuring, in the sense that, like JFK really was assassinated. This isn't about something, the battle in heaven or something like that. It's more tangible, even though the pattern is like really depressing, because
we demand a more realistic materialist psychosis.
Exactly.
But on an unconscious level, because it's more material, it fulfills even more.
Exactly.
It's more fulfilling. It's more fulfilling to the psychosis. The psychotic is more psychotic.
Yeah, but it's difficult to look at just the material world and say, like, obviously this is all adding up to something wonderful. Like,
it's better for us. It's better for the normal person, because they can say, they're crazy, but they're not that crazy. Whereas back then, I completely fucking lost my point. I'm not going to go on.
They're crazy, but they're not that crazy. But back then,
I was trying to. I was making a point about like how materialism produces a more satisfying psychosis, because they can. I had it the other way around. The psychotic can say, "I'm not that crazy," because everybody talks about JFK, everybody talks about 9/11. Right. Even people that don't believe in UFOs talk about UFOs. Whereas in the old days, it was more like, they talk about angels, but I see them, I interact with them. It's a much more elevated role, or role that's darker. Whereas now it's sort of like just a general eternal psychosis for everybody. Because we all have the same symbols. There's nothing holy to them. But there's a massive amount of holiness.
There's a strange element of choice to become part of this group psychosis that's so different than I am physically seeing a person who isn't there, right there. It's a very different psychosis.
True.
Than there's something about, you can assign yourself to this role to connect these dots in a fantastical sort of impossible way that's very paranoid.
Right, and you can be a conspiracy evangelical, right? You're trying to bring people into understanding of what's really going on. And that's another way that it's parallel to the religious universe. But if your psychosis is about Christianity, there's already Christianity. And even though Christianity is constantly splitting into people who have their own psychotic delusion about what the true message of the Bible was, you can probably find some place you fit. Whereas with the conspiracy world, I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theorists, so in a way it's an institution, but it's not quite in the same way. There aren't
another big thing similar to religion is that every branch of conspiracy theorists thinks that another one, like if you believe in the Jewish conspiracy, you say like people that believe in lizard people are out there to give us a bad name. Or people that are JFK conspiracy theorists will say that 9/11 conspiracy theorists are out there to give us a bad name. They're ruining our reputation. Just like a Baptist is like, you know, these wicked Unitarians are ruining our name.
Totally. It's totally true. Yeah, it's like, oh, the Catholics, they're so corrupt, you know, yada yada. But
oh yeah, there's one thing I want to say before I forget it again.
Okay.
I think it's important to take a look about how religion is a controlled sort of this impulse. The impulse of the psychotic is controlled in a very specific way because there's something pleasurable about connecting these dots in fantasy. And I think ethically, I think the BBS and sort of therapy organizations do. They see this rabbit hole and they very nicely recapture the drive in that. If socially it's acceptable, in this social culture it's automatically not psychotic, which is because they recognize but it's important to maybe go past that for a second,
right?
And recognize that there's something there's a fantasy creation between these sets that are essentially non-existent, and giving this sort of space for the exuberance of mania, right? And
you just inspired me. I just got an idea from what you were saying.
Okay.
The essence of what you were saying can be captured in the game Snake. Because it's like, as long as your snake moves around and doesn't touch its own tail, as long as it doesn't reach Ouroboros, it's sane, it's socially acceptable. But as soon as it's like, oh, it's insane. It's come full circle. Yeah. Whereas if you're able to have a socially acceptable obsession, like nobody cares if you're obsessed with comic books because you're buying something. I mean, I guess Alex Jones sells super male vitality, but it's not the same. It's not like you have to buy. It's not like you have a canon of products.
Right.
Like if you're gonna buy a bunch of stuff if you're obsessed with a socially acceptable thing. Whereas if you're obsessed with something that's not acceptable, there's nothing to buy.
Yeah.
Well, you have to maintain the distinction between fantasy and reality. But if you're part of a religious continuum that embraces in various
fantasy
ways,
is reality though.
There is no.
I recognize there's fantasy that's symbolic order that's just objectively incorrect. But you got to keep in mind that everything we create, all these signifiers, are only understood through fantasy. They're only understood through they're being in the thing. The discourses. We hysterically take in the analyst discourse the new master signifier is bridged through fantasy into the battery of signifiers. So it can be very dull. It can be like, oh, I didn't like this brand of cereal, and I didn't like this other brand of this other type of cereal. Ergo, I hate this whole brand of cereal. So that's fantasy creating. So it's not. You wouldn't be like someone says that they're like, you're psychotic, even though it's not necessarily true, right? So there's some role of that we need. We need these sort of places to exercise psychosis within a confine.
Because of your intervention, I'm going to restate my statement, and now it's like 10 times better. So you're supposed to be able to maintain the distinction between the real world and the text, right? Because the text is authored. There's an author. And the religious person is like, the whole world is authored by God. That's like the psychotic religious person, right? And because it's so important not to muddy those waters, because then you go, well, this fantasy that I'm having that seems real, is it just a fantasy? And then we could be constantly undermining our own, you know.
That kind of implies that that the basic Lacanian and basic Greek view of the view of logos as the most pure psychosis, which is that the word creates,
Right.
which is that the fantasy is the creative force.
Right.
Reality is psychotic. If we, and it's because it is true. It's true that language creates subject. Language creates it all. There is nothing without the word.
Right, but this is why I think people get so fascinated with these subjects, whether they're atheist and they think religious people are delusional, or whether they are rational and they think conspiracy theorists are delusional. It's so important to have this picture of the psychotic who is more psychotic than you are, and who has crossed the line, and they can't distinguish fiction from reality or the text from the real world with real objects in it. Because it's so important to do that, because nobody wants to feel that that's everybody's problem or their problem.
That's why we're really suffering from group psychosis in the form of literally text messages. You can't tell. You can't tell a text message from what the person actually is. Like people talk about being left on red or not being returned to Snapchat or something, but you're not able to see the difference between that human body and the text message or.
I would like to point out that we've actually discovered nihilism.
Yes.
In case you haven't realized it, we're now talking about the logos creating psychosis and ordered psychosis, and more in fantasy bridges, and the sort of non-real nature of it all. Which isn't that the topic of the discussion? Nihilism. I think that's I feel like that's a much more virulent strain, like as Lance says, virulent nihilism in Patil, and I think this is more virulent than Patil saying, "Oh, the obsession with the dwarf imp of the negative of the worst thing you can do."
Right.
I think that the acknowledgement of psychosis, in terms of the necessariness of psychosis, and the embracing of it in a structural setting, and how even the psychotic falls into these other of the archetype of the psychotic. Right.
So a virulent nihilist is a Dionysian who totally loves and accepts psychosis, whereas the virgin, we have the virgin nihilist and the Chad nihilist.
I guess I'll make that one. I'll make
Chad,
that one.
Virulent nihilist, the virgin.
Right now. I don't want to forget it.
We've reached it.
Isn't this such a better definition of nihilism than we could have just spun at the beginning of the conversation?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah.
Guys, do you want to end it on that note? I feel like
I think it's a beautiful note.
I think we can Lacanianly end on an important point. That's what Lacan would do, so that's what we can do right now. Sound good? All right, guys. Until next time.
V for Victor.
To be fair, you have to be very intelligent to understand Rick and Morty.
Very.
You have to have a very... Oh, wait. Oh, fuck. Oh, yeah. Okay. Hang it up.
All right.